The drop pod hit the ground like a thrown fist, punching through the last ribbon of cloud and slamming into black gravel that rang like broken glass. For a breath, the world went white, lightning close enough to turn the pod's tiny window into a sheet of milk. Then sound arrived, late and violent, a crack that rattled teeth and made the metal ribs of the capsule sing. The pod's restraints released with a clipped hydraulic sigh. The human cadet sat still for 2 seconds longer, listening to the storm as if the storm had a language and he could catch a word of it between the thunder. A red indicator pulsed above the hatch. Atmosphere breach safe. Another line of text scrolled beneath it in the Academy's clean, indifferent font. Survival evaluation, Stage 4. Rescue is conditional. He flexed his fingers. The gloves had been cut down to preserve dexterity, as if the designers assumed he would be doing delicate work, not crawling through mud under an electrified sky. He pressed his palm to the hatch and felt vibration, a constant tremor from the storm. The pod was already cooling, shedding heat into air that smelled like metal and wet stone. Ozone, sharp enough to taste. He opened the hatch. Wind slapped him first, a wet wall that forced a grunt out of his chest. Rain came in sheets, heavy drops that struck his visor and ran like quicksilver. The ground outside was not soil so much as shattered rock, dark shards fused into rippled plates. In the distance, jagged spires rose out of the plain like the teeth of some buried machine. Lightning crawled along those spires and jumped between them in branching nets that made the horizon flicker. The Academy had named the world Praxis 6 on the briefing screen, and the name had sounded neat, safe, catalogued. Down here, the planet did not feel like a number. The planet felt like a temper. A beacon case sat strapped to the pod's interior wall. He knew the rules before he looked. The Academy loved rules because rules could be graded. He unlatched the case anyway, and the hinge released with a reluctant click. Inside lay a unit the size of a helmet, matte gray, sealed, with the Academy crest stamped into one corner like a signature on a contract. A small display on its top blinked. No signal. Power insufficient. He dragged the unit out into the rain and set it on the ground. A gust shoved water under his collar. He hated that the cold was immediate. On training worlds, cold built slowly, like a lesson. Here it arrived like an accusation. A chime sounded in his earpiece, and his suit's comm module forced itself into receive only. The Academy did not waste live bandwidth on cadets unless the Academy wanted something. A hollow prompt shimmered at the edge of his visor, then stabilized into the calm face of Proctor Sato, the evaluation officer assigned to his cohort. Proctor Sato was not physically present, of course. Proctor Sato sat somewhere warm and clean, surrounded by screens and metrics, with an instructor's patience arranged neatly over something less kind. "Cadet," Proctor Sato said, "confirm visual and audio." He did not answer at first. He watched the spires and the lightning crawling across them like veins of light under skin. He watched the way the rain struck the fused rock and bounced in tiny crowns. He watched, because watching was what kept him from feeling the first rush of panic. "Cadet," Proctor Sato repeated, tone unchanged. "Confirm." "Visual and audio confirmed," he said. "Good." Proctor Sato's eyes flicked, not to him, but to the data overlay the human could not see. "You have been issued one standard Academy rescue beacon. The beacon will not function under local interference without adequate power and proper grounding. Rescue assets will remain in high orbit for a maximum window of 72 hours. He heard the unspoken part. After that, the ship would leave, because fuel budgets and schedules mattered more than a cadet. Proctor Sato continued. "Your objective is to transmit a verifiable rescue signal. Your performance is measured by problem-solving, resource acquisition, and signal integrity. If you cannot transmit, you will not be retrieved. This is not a punishment. This is an assessment." The human let out a short laugh that the wind almost stole. "That sounds like punishment." Proctor Sato did not smile. "The Academy trains officers for hostile environments. Officers do not receive rescue because officers request it. Officers receive rescue because officers make it feasible. Prove you are worth rescue. The phrase hit harder than the cold. It was not the cruelty of it. It was the bureaucracy inside it, the way the Academy had turned human life into a conditional clause. A flash turned the world into a negative photograph. Thunder followed, so close it felt like an impact in the chest. The hollow stuttered for half a second, then returned, perfectly composed. "You are being monitored," Proctor Sato said. "No direct assistance will be provided. You may use any material available on the surface, including parts of your drop pod. You may not access orbiting assets. Your suit has basic medical and environmental support for 72 hours. Rations included are minimal by design." He glanced at the beacon again. No signal. Power insufficient. The unit looked small against the planet's violence, like a polite device brought to a riot. "Any questions?" Proctor Sato asked. He had dozens. He had one that mattered. "What is the interference source?" Proctor Sato's gaze sharpened slightly, the faintest hint of approval leaking through the Academy's mask. "Local electromagnetic activity is extreme. Magnetic storms, constant atmospheric discharge. The planet's ionosphere is unstable. Conventional transmissions degrade. Distress signals are drowned." "So the beacon is a joke." "The beacon is a tool," Proctor Sato said. "How you use it is the point of the evaluation." He swallowed rain and bitterness. His tongue tasted like copper. "Understood." Proctor Sato nodded once. "Evaluation begins now. Your rescue window closes in 72 hours. Prove you are worth rescue." The hollow collapsed into static, then nothing. His comm module returned to silence, sealed shut like a door that would not open again until he forced it. For a moment he stood in the open hatch of the pod, rain streaming down his suit, and let the reality settle. The Academy's orbiting ship was up there, invisible behind cloud and chaos. Its crew would be watching the telemetry: heart rate, temperature, movement, stress markers. In some instructor's report, his first reaction would become a line item. He could almost hear the phrasing, "Cadet displayed initial hesitation. Cadet demonstrated situational awareness. Cadet remained verbal under stress." He stepped away from the pod and scanned the plane. The world offered no trees, no obvious shelter, just broken rock and the knife-edge shapes of those spires. Lightning struck one of the spires and split across it in a branching web, then leapt outward, skimming the ground in a crawling arc before vanishing. The hairs on his arms rose under his suit as the charge rolled through the air. He forced himself to breathe slowly. Panic spent energy he could not afford. He crouched beside the beacon and ran a gloved finger along its sealed casing. The unit was designed to survive impact, heat, dust. It was not designed to think. The display did not care that the sky above him contained more power than any battery the Academy would issue. The display cared only that the unit had not been fed in a way it recognized. Wind shifted, and the rain angled, needling the side of his visor. He turned his head to follow the direction. The spires were aligned in clusters, like a field of broken antennas. Between two clusters lay a shallow depression, darker than the surrounding rock. Water pooled there, rippling in the constant agitation of raindrops, and the surface shimmered oddly, as if the puddle held a thin film. He watched lightning strike again, farther this time but still within a breath, and he noticed something else. The storm was not random. It was furious, but it had rhythm. The lightning did not simply fall. It hunted, returning to certain points more often than others, as if the planet had favorite nerves. He stood, shoulders hunched against the wind, and took a slow step toward the depression. His boots scraped the fused rock with a sound like sandpaper on glass. He did not go far. He did not need to. He only needed enough information to decide his first move. Behind him, the drop pod loomed, a small cylinder of metal in a world that ate metal with electricity. It was shelter, temporarily. It was also a pile of parts. The Academy had given him permission to dismantle it because the Academy wanted to see if he could sacrifice comfort for function. Another flash, another crack. He felt the charge in his teeth. He looked up into the storm until the brightness made his eyes ache behind the visor. Somewhere above those clouds, rescue waited like a reward held just out of reach. The Academy wanted him pleading, improvising, begging the universe for a gap in the interference. He did not intend to beg. He returned to the beacon, planted his feet on the slick rock, and stared at the words on its display until his mind stopped seeing them as judgment and started seeing them as parameters. No signal. Power insufficient. "All right," he murmured, voice lost under the rain. "Then I will find power." He picked up the beacon with both hands and carried it back toward the drop pod, moving carefully, as if the ground itself could bite. Above him, the sky kept tearing open, again and again, and each tear felt less like a threat and more like a resource waiting to be claimed. He worked inside the open mouth of the drop pod with the hatch angled as a windbreak, rain still finding its way in through every seam. The beacon sat on the floor plating beside him, stubbornly blinking the same verdict. He ignored the display and focused on the suit's wrist console instead, pulling up environmental readouts the Academy could not fully lock down because the suit needed those readouts to keep him alive. Static crawled across several sensors, but the basics held: pressure, temperature, particulate count, electromagnetic noise. The last one spiked so violently it looked like a heartbeat in panic. He toggled the suit's magnetometer, then the field meter. The graph became a serrated saw, rising and dropping in aggressive rhythms. He watched long enough to stop seeing chaos and start seeing repetition. Not perfect repetition, storms never repeated perfectly, but clustered repetition, like footsteps returning to the same worn path. The spikes aligned with lightning strikes he could see through the hatch, and more importantly, the spikes surged before the visible flash, as if the air telegraphed its intent a moment early. He pulled a thin strip of salvage wire from a kit pocket, snapped the insulation with his thumbnail, and held the bare end up near the hatch. The wire shivered, not from wind, but from charge. Fine hairs along his wrist prickled under the suit sleeve. He lowered the wire and felt the prickling subside. He raised it again and felt the air thicken with invisible pressure. The planet was not merely throwing lightning at random. The planet was constantly loading the sky like a weapon being cocked and recocked. He needed to know where the planet liked to fire. The pod's emergency locker offered a small comfort: a manual map slate, preloaded with orbital terrain scans at low resolution. The Academy never gave high-resolution scans in field evaluations unless the point was navigation. Here the point was improvisation, so the map was intentionally vague, like a half-finished clue. He set the slate on the floor and dragged a finger across it, expanding the grid. The spire clusters showed up as jagged marks, darker than the surrounding plain. The shallow depression he had noticed appeared as a smudge. The slate did not show water, film, or anything that mattered. It showed shape, and shape was enough. He started assembling a different kit from the pod's internal panel: a hand drill, a coil of conductive braid, a compact optical rangefinder. He hesitated over the rangefinder and smiled once, humorless. The Academy had packed precision tools into a scenario that demanded brutality. He took it anyway. Precision was still power if he could make the planet care. Outside, lightning forked and hit one of the tallest spires in the nearest cluster. The flash lasted longer than most, a crawling network clinging to stone before releasing. He leaned closer to the hatch and watched the afterglow, faint, violet, lingering around the spire's tip. Ionization, still hanging in the rain-washed air. His suit's audio filter dampened the thunder, but it could not mute it completely. The sound traveled through the pod's hull, through the fused rock under his boots, through his bones. He closed his eyes for a few seconds and listened to the timing between cracks. Not the loudness, not the drama, the spacing. He counted in his head, steady, stubborn. 1, 2, 3, then a crack. Another pause, shorter, Another crack, a longer gap, a cluster of rapid strikes like angry punctuation. He opened his eyes and stared at the magnetometer graph again. The spikes matched the pattern he had counted. The storm spoke in intervals. If he could anticipate the intervals, he could position himself where the next strike wanted to land and build around that desire instead of fighting it. He stepped out of the pod with the map slate strapped to his forearm and the salvage wire coil looped across his shoulder. Rain slapped his visor. Wind shoved at his balance. The plane offered no mercy, but he was no longer asking for mercy. He moved toward the nearest spire cluster, keeping low, choosing footing on the rippled plates of fused rock that offered traction instead of slick glass. Every few steps he stopped and lifted the bare wire end again, measuring the prickling intensity, watching the suit's field meter tick upward or down. The spires loomed as he approached, taller than he had guessed. The rock around their bases was cracked, as if heat had repeatedly stressed it. In some places, the ground looked glazed, melted and rehardened into smooth black channels that ran outward like frozen rivers. His boots clicked against those channels with a sharper note. He crouched and ran his glove along one channel's edge. The surface was smoother than the surrounding rock, and under the glove he felt faint ridges like tiny bubbles trapped in glass. He brought the magnetometer closer to the channel. The noise rose, and the field meter surged. The channel was not just scar tissue, the channel was a path. He stood and looked along the channel's direction. It pointed toward the depression. Lightning struck again, farther away, but the air around the spires answered with a faint, crawling hiss, as if charge was skittering along invisible rails. He did not like being this exposed, but he liked ignorance less. He walked deeper into the cluster, circling the tallest spire at a cautious distance. The spire's surface was dark stone, shot through with metallic flecks that winked when lightning flashed. Those flecks were not decoration. Those flecks were why lightning loved this place. Conductive minerals, spread through the rock like nerves through muscle. He raised the rangefinder and measured distances between several spire tips. The spacing was not random. It formed a loose arc, and the arc aligned with the prevailing wind direction. The storm's wind fed charge into the arc, and the arc fed lightning back into the ground. He could almost see the circuit in his mind. Sky to stone, stone to channel, channel to depression, depression to something else hidden. He moved toward the depression and felt the temperature shift as he stepped onto lower ground. Water pooled there, churned by rain, and the surface shimmered under his light. He knelt at the edge, ignoring the ache in his knees, and dipped a gloved finger into the water. The film clung to the glove and broke in rainbow streaks. Oil. Natural seep or broken organic deposit spread thin across the puddle. Oil meant insulation. Oil meant controlled leakage. Oil meant he had a material that could resist the planet's constant desire to bleed charge everywhere at once. He scraped some of the oily film into a small sample pouch, then pressed his glove against the ground at the depression's edge. Under the slick surface layer, the soil was not soil but fine grit packed into hard clay. The clay held moisture. Moisture held ions. The depression was not just a low spot. It was a capacitor, charged and discharged 100 times a day as lightning fed it and rain kept it conductive. His suit's field meter spiked sharply. He froze. His breathing slowed until he could hear it. A faint buzzing grew at the edges of his hearing, not from the suit speakers but from the air itself. He lifted his gaze and saw a delicate corona dancing along the tips of the nearest spires, tiny violet flames that flickered in the rain. He backed away from the puddle in slow steps, careful not to stumble. The buzzing intensified, then steadied, like an animal deciding whether to pounce. He watched the cloud ceiling above the spires. The cloud base roiled, darker in one patch directly overhead, as if the storm was gathering its hand. He did not run. Running made mistakes. He moved with deliberate speed toward a flat slab of rock near the depression where the melted channels converged. He dropped to one knee, drove the hand drill into a crack, and twisted until the bit bit deep. The act was absurd under a sky preparing to strike, but the act was also a declaration. He would not be purely reactive. He would shape the strike point. He jammed the bare wire into the drilled hole and packed grit around it to hold it firm. The wire was too thin to take a strike, but he did not need it to take the strike. He needed it to feel the charge and show him where it wanted to go. He watched the wire. The end vibrated faster. The insulation on the coil hissed as static crawled along it. The suit's field meter screamed upward. The buzzing became a shriek. Lightning hit the tallest spire in the cluster with a flash so bright it punched through his visor's auto-dimming. The thunder arrived with a brutal snap that made the drilled wire jump. A sheet of charge raced down the spire, split along the melted channels, and ran toward the depression in a branching surge that turned the wet ground into a glowing vein network for half a second. He saw the path clearly now. Sky to spire, spire to channel, channel to depression. The planet had a preferred route, a natural circuit etched into stone. He exhaled hard and tasted metal even through the suit filters. His heart hammered, but his mind felt strangely calm. Fear was still there, sharp at the edges, but it had become useful, pointing him toward what mattered. A second strike followed quickly, hitting a different spire along the arc. The same surge ran along the channels, converging again toward the depression as if pulled by a magnet. The depression did not erupt. The oil film dampened the surface, spreading the energy and preventing immediate flashover. The planet had built a buffer here, unintentionally, but reliably. He stared at the convergence point where the channels met. The spot looked darker, more polished, as if repeated current had fused it. He imagined placing a structure there, not to fight the surge, but to guide it. He imagined a tall collector that invited lightning more efficiently than the spires. He imagined grounding paths that could handle the current without exploding, and insulation layers made from oil and stone. He imagined a pulse pattern cut into the planet's own circuit, something that would stand out against natural noise. The suit's timer ticked in the corner of his visor, counting down his 72 hours in quiet seconds. He did not look away from the channels. He did not need to see the timer to feel it. He needed a plan that began now, not tomorrow. He returned to the pod with wet grit clinging to his boots and oil sealed in the sample pouch. On the way, he stopped 3 times to lift the wire and confirm his readings. The storm's rhythm held. The magnetometer spikes surged in clusters, and the clusters repeated with slight drift. The arc of spires acted like a metronome, and the depression acted like a drum. Inside the pod, he spread the map slate and began marking points with a stylus. Spire tips, channel lines, convergence nodes. He wrote numbers beside them, timing intervals between strikes, distance estimates, field intensity peaks. The notes were messy, cramped by rainwater and shaking hands, but the pattern emerged anyway. The planet was loud, but the planet was consistent. Consistency meant predictability. Predictability meant engineering. He leaned back against the pod wall, listening to the thunder roll and the hull ring. The beacon's display still blinked its dull refusal, but the words no longer felt final. No signal meant he would have to create a signal the storm could not hide. Power insufficient meant he would have to steal power from the sky itself. He looked at the coil of conductive braid, then at the pod's structural ribs, then at the sample pouch of oil. He pictured the spires outside, waiting like natural lightning rods. He pictured the convergence point near the depression, polished by repeated current. The storm did not need to be defeated. The storm needed to be recruited. He stood, rolled his shoulders, and began stripping panels from the pod with steady hands, selecting metal pieces by thickness and shape, sorting fasteners into neat piles. The Academy monitored his movement, but the Academy could not see the decision settling into his spine. He would not broadcast desperation. He would broadcast intent. When Rescue finally detected his call, Rescue would not be answering a plea. Rescue would be responding to a signal forged out of lightning's own language. He finished dismantling the drop pod by instinct rather than plan, letting his hands choose what the storm would tolerate. Thin panels were discarded first, then composite ribs that rang too sharply when struck. He kept the heavier structural arcs, curved metal meant to survive impact, and stacked them near the pod's shadow where rain hit with slightly less force. By the time the hull was an open skeleton, his gloves were slick with oil and grit, and his shoulders burned from repetitive strain. The pain grounded him. Pain meant progress. He hauled the first arc toward the convergence point near the depression, dragging it over fused stone that screamed in protest. Each movement was timed between thunderclaps, not because the noise mattered, but because the thunder marked where lightning had already been. He moved in the storm's wake, not ahead of it. When the air prickled too hard and the buzzing rose, he stopped and crouched until the pressure eased. The storm punished impatience. At the convergence point, he drove a steel wedge into a crack and levered the arc upright. It leaned at first, listing like a drunk, until he packed stone around the base and tamped it down with the butt of a tool. The metal vibrated faintly, humming to the rhythm of distant strikes. He did not fight the hum. He adjusted the arc's angle until the vibration steadied, then locked it in place with braided wire looped tight and twisted until his forearms shook. He stepped back and watched. Lightning struck a spire along the arc, and charge ran down the familiar channels. The surge licked the base of his metal arc and split, some energy bleeding into the ground, some crawling up the metal in thin, branching fingers that faded before reaching the top. The arc was not tall enough yet. It tasted the storm but did not invite it. He returned to the pile and chose another arc, this one longer, heavier. He bolted it to the first, overlapping the ends and binding the joint with wire soaked in oil to slow unwanted leakage. The smell of ozone thickened as he worked, sharp enough to sting his eyes even through the visor filters. He built upward carefully, adding height in increments, testing stability after each addition. The structure became a crooked spine of metal, rising from the rock like something grown rather than assembled. Rain sheeted down the metal and ran along the joints. He brushed oil over the outer surfaces in controlled streaks, not to insulate completely, but to guide. Bare metal where he wanted the storm's attention. Slickened metal where he wanted restraint. The oil caught rainbow light in each flash, painting the structure with brief color before darkness reclaimed it. He hammered a ring of ground conductors into the rock around the base, driving rods into cracks and packing them with wet grit and clay from the depression. Each rod was bound to the main spine with braided conductor, forming a cage that spread outward like roots. He worked quickly now, sweat pooling under his collar despite the cold. The storm's rhythm had shifted. The intervals shortened. The planet was winding itself tighter. A flash exploded overhead closer than before. Thunder struck almost instantly, a brutal concussion that shoved him sideways. He hit the ground hard, breath knocked from his chest, visor flashing warning icons. He rolled instinctively, curling around his helmet as a secondary surge rippled along the channels and crackled around the base of the structure. Sparks danced across the oil-slicked surface and died with angry snaps. He lay still for a count of 5, then pushed himself up. His hands shook, but nothing was broken. The structure still stood. It had taken the surge and lived. That mattered more than comfort. He planted a final arc at the top, thinner than the others but extended with a forked tip he had cut and bent deliberately. The fork pointed toward the densest part of the storm cell overhead. He adjusted the angle by degrees, watching the air around the tip shimmer faintly. When the corona began to flicker without a strike, he stopped adjusting. He locked it down and retreated to the base. The next strike did not hit a spire. Lightning tore down from the clouds and slammed into the forked tip with a sound like the sky breaking its teeth. White filled his vision. The shockwave flattened the rain into a moving wall. He felt the impact through the ground, through his boots, through his ribs. For a heartbeat, he thought the structure would explode, metal shredding outward in lethal fragments. Instead, the current raced down the spine, split cleanly into the ground cage, and vanished into the wet rock with a roar like a waterfall poured through wires. The oil burned in thin, controlled flames that crawled and died, leaving blackened streaks. The structure glowed dull red for a second, then dimmed as heat bled away into the rain. He laughed. A raw sound ripped from his throat before he could stop it. It was not joy. It was relief edged with awe. He had not just survived a direct strike. He had shaped it. He did not wait. He ran to the beacon, carried it to the base, and cracked open its casing. The Academy seal protested, then broke. Inside lay coils, capacitors, and a control core that looked insultingly fragile after what he had just witnessed. He tore out the internal battery without ceremony and rerouted the input terminals to accept raw feed. The suit's warning chimes screamed in his ear as he worked with exposed conductors, but he silenced them. Noise wasted focus. He mounted the beacon on a stone plinth he built quickly, stacking flat slabs and mortaring them with clay and grit. The plinth lifted the unit just enough to keep floodwater from swallowing it. He ran heavy braided lines from the base cage into a crude regulator assembly he built from scavenged coils and insulating stone. The regulator would not smooth the power completely. It would only keep the beacon from vaporizing on first contact. Another strike hit the fork. The regulator screamed, coils heating and oil smoking. The beacon's display flickered, went dark, then flared to life with a harsh amber glow. Power input detected scrolled across the screen, letters jittering as the storm roared overhead. He slammed a hand against the casing in something like affection. "Stay alive," he muttered. He adjusted the regulator between strikes, shaving down stone, tightening wire, widening gaps to bleed excess heat. The storm punished mistakes immediately. One misjudged turn sent a surge arcing sideways, blowing a conductor apart in a shower of sparks that burned his glove. He bit down on a curse and fixed it, fingers numb with cold and pain. When the power stabilized enough to hold, he turned to the signal logic. A constant broadcast would drown in the storm's noise. He needed rhythm. He needed contrast. He programmed the beacon to pulse only at peak input, shaping the storm's own cadence into deliberate intervals. The beacon would speak when lightning spoke, not in between. It would ride the loudest moments and twist them into pattern. He set the first test and backed away. Lightning struck. The structure sang. The beacon flared bright, then dimmed, then flared again in a controlled sequence that echoed the strike but did not mimic it perfectly. The pulses cut across the electromagnetic chaos like a scar. He watched the sky as much as the display. The storm reacted, not consciously, but physically. The forked tip drew strikes more often now, stealing attention from the spires. The arc of natural lightning shifted, bending toward his creation. The planet was learning a new habit. He made small adjustments through the night cycle, tightening pattern, sharpening edges. He carved grooves into stone to route excess flow. He deepened ground rods where the heat lingered. He worked until his muscles trembled and his vision blurred, then forced himself to stop and drink from his ration pack with shaking hands. From a distance, the beacon array looked obscene against the wild landscape. A crooked metal spine clawing at the sky, wrapped in wires and blackened oil, crowned with a fork that burned with violet fire between strikes. Each time lightning hit, the beacon answered, flashing its defiant rhythm into the storm's heart. He leaned against a rock, rain running down his visor in steady lines, and allowed himself one quiet thought. If the Academy was watching closely, the Academy would already be uncomfortable. This was no longer a cadet solving a puzzle. This was a human rewriting the problem until the planet itself became part of the solution. Another strike. Another pulse. The storm howled, furious and alive, and he stood at its center, soaked, exhausted, and unbroken, shaping lightning into a voice that could not be ignored. The storm changed first in the small ways that only a tired mind could still notice. The wind began arriving in pulses instead of a constant shove, as if the air itself had adopted the beacon's rhythm. Rain that had fallen in chaotic sheets started to slant in repeating angles, then straighten, then slant again, following pressure waves that matched the timing between his programmed bursts. Each lightning strike hit with the same brutality, but the space between strikes felt less random. The gaps had shape now, like the pauses between words. He did not trust the feeling. He checked the suit's field meter and saw the noise floor rising. The entire sky was louder in electromagnetic terms, not quieter. His beacon had not calmed the storm. His beacon had taught the storm a new kind of pattern, and that pattern was spreading across the ionosphere like ink through water. He woke after a short, forced sleep with a start, certain he had heard his name. The sound was only thunder rolling in a way that mimicked syllables. He sat up behind a low stone berm he had built near the base of the array, shoulders cramped, hands stiff. His glove burn had blistered under the suit patch. Pain throbbed in time with his heartbeat. The beacon's display glowed through the rain, steady and harsh, and each pulse of its broadcast was mirrored by faint violet flickers along the forked tip above. He crawled out into the open and stared upward. The corona on the collector fork was stronger than before, dancing constantly now, not only at the moment of strike. Tiny filaments of charge stretched from the tip into the air and snapped back like invisible lashes. Every so often a streamer reached down from the cloud base, met the rising filament, and then the full bolt slammed through the connection. His structure had become an invitation the sky could not stop accepting. He did not celebrate. More strikes meant more power, but more strikes also meant more heat and more fatigue in his materials. The regulator coils were blackened. Several ground leads had fused at their junctions into ugly knots. He knelt at the base and pressed a gloved palm to one coil housing. The heat was still dangerous even under rain. He pulled his hand away and tasted ozone again. The suit timer ticked on. The numbers were smaller now. The rescue window was bleeding away. He needed proof that the signal had escaped the storm and reached orbit. Without confirmation, he could be screaming into a void while the Academy watched him exhaust himself. He looked toward the horizon where the spires stood in their arc, and he realized the arc was no longer the storm's only skeleton. The air above the spires flickered with faint responses after each beacon burst, like a delayed echo. Lightning began jumping between spire tips in short, lateral flashes that did not fully touch the ground. The spires were acting like relays, catching the electromagnetic pulse and re-radiating it, pushed by the ionized air. His signal was not a single point anymore. It was being copied by the landscape. He stood and walked into the open, away from his shelter, away from the comforting solidity of the metal spine. The rain hit harder out there. Wind shoved him sideways. He forced his boots forward anyway, following the shallow channels toward the nearest spire. His suit's sensors whined under the interference, but he could still read enough to know that something had changed. The magnetometer spikes were broader now, less needle-like. The storm was not merely discharging. The storm was resonating. At the base of the spire, he tilted his head back. The stone was slick with water and glittered with metallic flecks. A faint humming vibrated in the air around it, a sound not carried by wind, but by charge. He raised his bare wire test lead. He had kept one thin strip for this purpose, and the wire lifted toward the spire as if pulled. Static crackled along its length. When the beacon pulse went out behind him, the spire answered with a brief shimmer at its tip and a tiny lateral arc to a neighboring spire. He swallowed. The planet's network was waking up. The Academy had warned him about interference as if interference were simply noise. Here, the interference was a living medium, a dense soup of charged particles ready to carry anything with enough amplitude and rhythm. Natural lightning was loud but incoherent. His beacon was loud and coherent. Coherence invited structure. A line of lightning stitched between three spires in quick succession, like a needle pulling thread. The pattern matched his last burst spacing almost perfectly. He felt his throat tighten. The storm was beginning to speak his timing back to him. He forced himself to return to the array, moving carefully as the buzzing in the air rose and fell. At the base, he opened the beacon's control panel and checked the pulse sequence he had programmed. The pattern was clean, but it could become cleaner. He had used a simple, repeated interval because it was easy to implement and easy to recognize. The storm had learned it too easily. If the storm could mimic the pattern unintentionally, the Academy might decide the signal was not verifiable. He needed a signature that could not occur naturally, something with asymmetry and deliberate structure, something that would stand out even inside a storm that had begun echoing him. He adjusted the sequence into a more complex cadence, spacing bursts in a prime number rhythm, inserting a longer pause after every set, then a short cluster that served as a marker. He built in a repeating header, 3 fast pulses, 1 slow, then the body of the message. He did not need to transmit language. He needed to transmit intent, a pattern that proved a mind was behind it. As he worked, the sky answered with a strike so close he felt his skin crawl under the suit. The regulator screamed, and the beacon's internal lights flickered. He slammed the panel shut and braced. Lightning hit the fork. The entire structure flared, and for a moment the air around it became a web of violet fire. The new cadence fired automatically, riding the peak input. 3 fast pulses flashed, then 1 slow. Across the horizon, the spire tips shimmered faintly in response, not perfectly synchronized, but close enough to prove the pulse had reached them. He stared at the spires and realized the signal was turning the planet itself into a transmitter. Each spire was an accidental antenna. Each patch of ionized air was a conductor. His beacon was not only shouting upward. His beacon was spreading outward, expanding the footprint of the message until the sky above him became a charged dome pulsing with his rhythm. He felt a flicker of triumph, then forced it down. Triumph could wait. The structure still had to survive long enough for someone in orbit to notice. He reinforced the ground cage with additional rods cut from the pod's remaining supports, driving them into cracks until his arms shook. He smeared oil along select junctions, creating controlled insulation where he had seen unwanted arcs. He laid stone slabs over exposed conductors, not to hide them, but to force current along paths he chose. He became less a builder and more a conductor, orchestrating flow. Hours passed in a blur of rain and light. The storm never relented, but the pattern held. Each time the beacon fired, he watched the horizon for echoes. The echoes grew clearer. Lateral arcs between spires occurred more often after his bursts, as if the spires were anticipating his next line. Once, a sheet of lightning rippled across the cloud base in a wide, branching fan that mirrored the header of his sequence. 3 fast flickers, 1 slow, before collapsing into random discharge again. He backed away from the array and looked up, heart hammering. That had not been his beacon directly. That had been the sky itself responding at scale. The ionosphere was carrying his signature and reflecting it, like a drum skin vibrating after being struck. His comm module remained locked. No voice came through, no confirmation. The silence was cruel, but the evidence above him was undeniable. Something in orbit, if it was listening, would see an impossible thing. Storm noise that had acquired a repeating asymmetric structure. No natural system maintained prime number cadence over hours. No weather pattern inserted headers and markers with disciplined repetition. If a rescue ship's sensors were worth anything, those sensors would flag the anomaly. He imagined the proctors in their warm control rooms staring at a graph that refused to behave. He imagined Proctor Sato's expression tightening, the first crack in that calm mask, as the planet's electromagnetic output began drawing clean lines where only chaos should exist. The Academy had wanted him begging through interference. Instead, he had turned interference into a carrier wave. Late in the cycle, when the clouds thinned for a brief, rare moment, he saw a faint pinprick of light far above, too steady to be lightning, too distant to be a star behind cloud. A ship light, perhaps, peeking through the storm gap. His breath caught. He lifted his arm instinctively, as if he could wave at orbit. The gap closed. Darkness returned. Thunder rolled. The pinprick vanished. He did not let himself hope. Hope softened the hands. He returned to the base and checked every junction, every knot of wire, every coil housing. He tightened, reinforced, replaced. He watched the beacon's display as it logged bursts, watched the power input numbers jitter and surge, watched the temperature warnings climb and fall. He worked as if the ship had already decided to leave, as if only perfection could change that decision. Then, between two thunderclaps, he heard a different sound. A thin, high chirp buried under static in his earpiece. It lasted only a fraction of a second, then cut off. His body went rigid. The comm module was locked, but the suit hardware still existed. If something strong enough reached it, the lock might not fully suppress the physical signal. He held his breath and listened. Another chirp. Slightly longer this time. The tone pattern was simple, almost crude, but it was not thunder, and it was not lightning. It was a beacon ping, a recognition pulse, a machine answering a machine. His mouth went dry. He stared up at the sky, rain running down his visor like tears he refused to shed, and he whispered into the storm as if the storm were the one that needed convincing. "See it," he said. "You have to see it." Lightning struck. The array sang. The beacon fired its header. 3 fast pulses, 1 slow, and far across the horizon the spire tips shimmered in answering flickers. The sky carried his signature outward, upward, everywhere. Under that vast, violent dome of charged air, his small rhythm persisted, stubborn as a heartbeat, until even the Academy's silence began to crack under the pressure of undeniable proof. The chirps returned at irregular intervals, never long enough to form words, but consistent enough to prove a receiver had locked onto his signature. He stood in the rain beside the beacon and kept his hands away from the exposed panel, as if touching it might jinx the fragile link. The storm still bellowed overhead, but his pulse pattern remained intact, riding each strike like a rider clinging to a stampede. Every time the beacon fired its header, the spire tips in the distance shimmered back, and the air between them crackled with faint lateral arcs, the planet's own network amplifying his insistence. Hours passed. His joints stiffened. His burned glove began to seep under the patch. He forced himself to drink again, forced himself to chew a ration bar that tasted like dust and salt, and forced his eyes to stay open through the sting of ozone. The suit timer ticked closer to the end of the window, and the number sat in his peripheral vision like a blade. A new sound broke through the static, a longer tone, modulated, rising then falling. It cut through the interference with the same kind of deliberate asymmetry he had used in his own pulses. He froze, then turned his head slowly toward the sky, as if looking up too fast might scare the signal away. The tone repeated, closer in time to his header. 3 short chirps, 1 long. An acknowledgement that mirrored his pattern, not perfectly, but with intent. His throat tightened. The comm lock could not translate it into speech, but the suit speakers still carried the raw audio. Someone up there was answering in the only language the storm would allow. He staggered to the metal spine and pressed his palm against one of the lower arcs. The structure vibrated with each discharge, alive and hot beneath the rain. The vibration steadied when the response tones came, as if the storm itself became briefly organized by the exchange. He did not know if that was physics or exhaustion playing tricks, but he clung to it anyway. He lifted his wrist console and watched for any status change, any official message. Nothing. The Academy had designed the evaluation to deny comfort. Even now, when rescue was close, the system refused to give him certainty. He made his own certainty. He opened the beacon panel and added one final element to the cadence. A long pause after the header, then a short burst pattern that encoded a simple coordinate signature derived from the map slate grid. The coding was crude, more rhythm than data, but it would narrow search error if the ship's sensors were forced to triangulate through chaos. He did not add a plea. He added precision. Lightning slammed into the forked tip, and the beacon broadcast the updated sequence. Immediately, the reply tone from orbit returned, stronger, longer, like a hand squeezing his shoulder through vacuum and storm. He laughed again, but the sound broke halfway into a cough. His chest hurt. His lungs tasted like metal. He leaned forward with hands on knees, breathing hard, rain pouring off his helmet, and for the first time since the pod had opened, he let himself feel how close to the edge he had been walking. The Academy's observers would interpret his hunched posture as fatigue. He interpreted it as survival. The storm abruptly deepened, darkening into a bruised purple. The wind shifted direction and intensified, driving rain sideways with needle force. The collector fork's corona flared bright and constant, and the regulator coils began to whine in a high pitch that set his teeth on edge. The storm was building to a major discharge cycle, the kind that made even the spire's lateral arcs snap like whips. His structure could take repeated strikes, but a full surge could overload the ground cage and flash back through the beacon, turning his work into molten scrap. He faced the array and made a choice that felt like swallowing fire. Rescue was responding now, but rescue still had not arrived. If the array failed in the final stretch, the storm would swallow his signature again. He could not allow that. He moved through the rain to the regulator assembly and began widening the bleed gaps, carving insulating stone away with a tool until his fingers numbed. He reinforced the ground cage junctions with additional wet clay, forcing the current into deeper cracks where the rock stayed cooler. He smeared oil in a continuous band along a key joint to prevent sideways arcing that had started to appear as faint blue snakes. Each adjustment was a wager placed against a sky that had no mercy. A massive strike hit the fork and lingered, a continuous channel of white that made the whole world vibrate. The metal spine screamed, a sound like a living thing in pain. The regulator flared, and for a terrifying moment the beacon display went dark. He lunged, slapped the casing, and felt heat bite through the glove. The display flashed back, jittering, then stabilized. The beacon fired its header, 3 fast, 1 slow, then held the pause, then released the coordinate burst. The reply tone came instantly this time, louder, layered, as if multiple receivers in orbit were now locked onto him. The suit speakers crackled, then produced a clipped, compressed voice that broke through in fragments, half drowned by static. "Cadet, signal, confirmed, hold position." The words were jagged, but the meaning was clean. He straightened as if a cable had yanked his spine upright. He did not answer. The comm lock still blocked transmission. He only nodded into the rain, a reflexive gesture to an unseen pilot, and turned back to the array because holding position was not passive here. Holding position meant keeping the storm harness intact. Minutes later, the clouds above the spire arc brightened with a different light, steady and cold, not the frantic white of lightning. The light swept across the cloud base in a broad cone, then vanished, then returned from a slightly different angle. Search beams. The ship had dropped lower, risking the ionosphere's violence to look for him. He stepped out from the shelter berm and raised both arms, not because the ship could see him clearly, but because the gesture made him feel less like a test subject and more like a person being found. Lightning cracked nearby, and the beam flickered but did not vanish. It steadied, focused, and then the cone narrowed onto his location as if the ship had finally drawn a straight line through all the chaos. The ground began to tremble, subtly at first, then more insistently. Not thunder this time. Engine resonance, transmitted through air and stone. The storm reacted with fury, throwing extra strikes toward the brightest patch of sky, but the ship's field systems held, a shimmering distortion visible for a heartbeat when lightning splashed against it. A shuttle descended through the cloud gap, like a piece of night ripped loose and given purpose. Its lights were shielded, its surfaces matte, but sparks still crawled along its hull as the air tried to claw at it. The shuttle hovered above the depression, fighting wind shear, then dropped hard onto the fused rock with a controlled slam that sent water splashing outward in a ring. The hatch opened, and a figure emerged in a sealed suit with a posture that screamed discipline. The visor was reflective, hiding the face. The figure moved quickly, tether lines snapping out, boots magnet locking to the slick rock. The shuttle's hull bore the Academy insignia, bright even under rain. The figure reached him and stopped at arm's length. A female voice came through an external speaker, distorted but clear enough. "Cadet, medical status." He tried to speak and his throat refused at first, raw from ozone and shouting over thunder that had never hurt him. He swallowed and forced sound out. "Functional. Minor burn. Exhaustion." The female voice paused, then softened by a fraction. "Signal integrity was unexpected. You built an atmospheric capture array." He glanced back at his crooked metal spine, still drawing strikes, still pulsing its rhythm. The beacon continued broadcasting even now, stubbornly refusing to stop until commanded. "I built a way to be heard." The female figure turned her helmet toward the array, and for a moment she simply watched as lightning hit the fork, and the beacon answered. The spire tips on the horizon shimmered faintly in response, as if even the planet wanted to witness the ending. "We are here," she said. "Extraction in 60 seconds." He nodded, but his feet did not move. His gaze stayed fixed on the structure as if leaving it meant abandoning part of himself. He had poured his time and pain into those wires and stones. It felt wrong to walk away while it still fought the storm. The female rescuer followed his gaze. "Cadet, the array will not be recovered. Leave it." He stared at the beacon display, watched the header cycle again. 3 fast pulses, 1 slow. Proof of mind, proof of refusal, proof of worth. He reached out, shut the panel fully, and set the beacon's sequence to a final mode. A clean termination burst, a signature ending that would tell the ship's sensors the transmission had ended by choice, not by failure. When the next strike hit, the beacon fired the termination pattern and went dark. For the first time in days, the air felt slightly quieter. He turned away, and the simple act felt like tearing free of a hook. The female rescuer guided him toward the shuttle. His legs resisted, heavy with fatigue, but he kept moving. The shuttle hatch swallowed them, and the interior was suddenly warmer, drier, filled with filtered air that did not taste like metal. The hatch sealed. The engines rose in pitch. Through a small viewport he saw his array one last time, a crooked silhouette against a sky that still raged. Without the beacon's rhythm, the storm began to drift back toward its old habits, lightning redistributing across the spires, chaos reclaiming the pattern. The shuttle lifted, punching upward through rain and cloud. The turbulence threw him against a restraint, and he felt the sting of bruises he had ignored. The female rescuer secured him with practiced efficiency, then looked at him through her reflective visor. "Proctor Sato will want a debrief," she said. "The Academy recorded everything." He let out a slow breath. "Good." The shuttle broke through the cloud ceiling, and for the first time he saw the main rescue ship, a sleek wedge of metal hovering above the storm, lights steady, hull unmarred by the violence below. The contrast made him almost angry. Up here, everything looked controlled. Down there, control had been a hand-built illusion, wrestled from lightning with bleeding fingers. Inside the ship, a medical officer met him at the airlock. A male voice, brisk, professional. "Sit. Helmet off. Breathe." He obeyed, and when the helmet seals released, warm air washed over his face. He smelled antiseptic instead of ozone. His hands began to shake harder now that danger was receding. Adrenaline, finally spending itself. Later, in a debrief chamber with dry walls and soft lighting, Proctor Sato appeared on a screen again. The face was the same calm mask, but something in the eyes had changed. Caution, perhaps. Respect, perhaps. The Academy did not like being surprised. "You transmitted," Proctor Sato said. "Signal was verified and triangulated despite extreme interference. You maintained function under sustained hazard. You demonstrated—" Proctor Sato paused, searching for a term that fit within Academy categories. "Resourcefulness beyond expected parameters." He held Proctor Sato's gaze. "The parameters were designed to fail." "The parameters were designed to evaluate," Proctor Sato corrected, then hesitated again. Your method will be reviewed. Safety implications are significant. Safety, he repeated, tasting the word. The Academy told me to prove I was worth rescue. I proved rescue was possible. Silence stretched. The ship's hum filled it. Finally, Proctor Sato inclined the head. Your evaluation is recorded as a pass. Your approach will be added to curriculum under controlled conditions. Future cohorts will study the storm network phenomenon and atmospheric capture design. He felt something in his chest loosen, not triumph, but closure. The Academy would turn his desperation into a lesson plan. That was how institutions survived. Still, the knowledge would remain, and knowledge saved lives even when it was born from cruelty. Proctor Sato's tone softened by a fraction, the closest thing to admission. Cadet, you were retrieved because you made retrieval feasible. He nodded once. That was the point. When the screen went dark, he sat alone for a moment and pictured the planet below, still raging, still indifferent, still alive with lightning. His array would corrode. The storm would tear it apart eventually. The spires would stand long after the metal spine fell. Yet for a brief stretch of hours, under a sky that wanted him silent, he had forced the world to carry his voice. He stood, flexed his bandaged hand, and walked out of the debrief chamber toward the ship's corridor lights. Rescue had arrived, not as a gift, but as a consequence of stubborn engineering. The Academy would move on to the next test, the next cadet, the next cruel slogan. He would move on, too, carrying a quieter certainty. If the universe demanded proof of worth, he would answer with work, and he would make even lightning listen.